George Eastman built an empire by making photography simple, then used a revolver to make his death the same way. The man who democratized the camera died in a mansion where every door was controlled by a central panel, every room wired for sound, and every window designed to let in light he could no longer see. He left a note that read, "To my friends, my work is done. Why wait?" But the work wasn't done. Kodak was still printing money. His fortune was intact. And the people who depended on him were still very much alive. So what actually happened in that house wasn't a conclusion. It was a systems failure disguised as a personal decision. Most people think wealth buys control. Eastman proved the opposite. The richer he became, the more his life was managed by mechanisms he built but could no longer steer. And when those mechanisms stopped serving him, they didn't shut down. They just kept running. If you're still listening, you're already wondering what kind of control you think you have. Eastman didn't inherit his fortune. He engineered it. In the 1880s, photography required glass plates, toxic chemicals, and a technician to operate the equipment. Eastman eliminated all three. He invented flexible film, sold it in a box with a fixed focus camera, and told people to mail the whole thing back when they were done. Kodak would develop the pictures, reload the camera, and send it back. 100 pictures for $25. The tagline was, "You press the button, we do the rest." It wasn't just a product. It was a system. And systems scale. By 1900, Eastman had 1,500 employees. By 1920, over 20,000. Kodak wasn't just a company. It was the infrastructural backbone of memory itself. Weddings, wars, childhoods, crime scenes, if it was photographed, it was probably on Kodak film. Eastman controlled the material that controlled the image. And he built that control into a mansion on East Avenue in Rochester, New York, where oil barons and industrialists competed to see whose house could make the loudest architectural argument for permanence. Eastman's argument was louder than most. 50 rooms. A pipe organ with custom controls in multiple rooms. A conservatory designed to replicate an English garden in a city that froze solid for half the year. Mahogany walls. Tiffany glass. A servant staircase that allowed staff to move through the house without being seen. Everything designed for hosting, for projecting mastery, for making sure that when powerful people visited, they understood who held the superior position. The house wasn't just shelter. It was infrastructure for status. And Eastman treated it like one of his factories, obsessively efficient, relentlessly controlled, and built to run whether he was present or not. But infrastructure requires maintenance. And at some point, Eastman's body stopped qualifying as maintainable. By 1930, Eastman was 77. His spine was degenerating. Walking became painful, then difficult, then something he did only when necessary. He hired specialists. He tried treatments. Nothing worked. Pain, for someone like Eastman, wasn't just a sensation. It was a design flaw. And design flaws were supposed to be solvable. When they weren't, the system lost its logic. Here's the first mechanism most people miss. Eastman didn't fear death. He feared dependence. For 50 years, he controlled every variable in his environment. His employees, his schedule, his philanthropic priorities, even the music that played in his house, all of it structured to eliminate randomness. But chronic pain introduces randomness. It forces waiting. It requires help. It turns the body into an uncooperative instrument that doesn't respond to instructions. And for someone whose entire identity is built on eliminating inefficiency, that's not suffering. It's obsolescence. Wealth didn't protect him from this. It accelerated it. Because the same resources that let him design the perfect house also let him design the perfect exit. And once that option became visible, staying alive required a reason that outweighed the system's most elegant solution. He didn't find one. On March 14, 1932, Eastman met with his lawyers. He signed revisions to his will. He hosted a small gathering of friends for lunch. He played the organ. Then he went upstairs to his bedroom, took out a Luger pistol he'd owned for years, placed a wet towel over his chest to minimize mess, and shot himself through the heart. The note was found on his desk, written in his characteristically efficient handwriting. No drama. No explanation. Just a conclusion. The people who found him were employees, not family. Eastman never married. He had no children. His closest relationships were with his mother, who had died years earlier, and a small circle of friends who described him as warm in private and mechanical in public. The person who probably spent the most time with him in his final years was his personal physician, who later said Eastman spoke often about the logic of ending life when it stopped being useful. Not in despair. In calculation. That's the second mechanism. Eastman didn't lose his mind. He kept it. And that was the problem. Most people who consider suicide are trapped in distorted thinking. Eastman's thinking wasn't distorted. It was hyper-rational. He assessed his condition, projected future decline, measured it against his values, and concluded that continuing offered no return on investment. The wealthier someone becomes, the more their decisions are shaped by efficiency metrics. And when life itself is subjected to that analysis, the conclusion isn't always survival. If you're realizing that wealth can make death feel rational, you're starting to see the shape of the trap. Now here's where the story gets structural. Eastman's death didn't disrupt Kodak. The company continued. The mansion continued. His fortune was distributed exactly as planned. Charitable foundations received millions. The University of Rochester, which he'd funded for decades, got enough to build entire departments. Eastman Dental Dispensary, Eastman School of Music, multiple hospitals, his name stayed attached to institutions that would outlast every person who remembered him alive. The system absorbed his absence without friction. But here's what the system didn't account for. Eastman designed his wealth to be useful after he was gone. He did not design it to make his life more bearable while he was still in it. The infrastructure he built was optimized for legacy, not longevity. And that's a feature, not a bug, of how extreme wealth operates. It becomes forward-facing. It plans for decades. It constructs institutions. And somewhere in that process, the present tense stops mattering. Eastman lived in a house with 50 rooms, but he used maybe 6. He employed dozens of people, but spent most of his time alone. He had access to the best medical care in the world, but medicine couldn't solve the thing that mattered most, the erosion of autonomy. His wealth gave him infinite options and zero relief. That's not irony. That's how systems of control collapse when the person at the center is no longer the beneficiary. The mansion itself is evidence. After Eastman's death, it was maintained for a few years as a house museum, then converted into office space, then partially restored as a historical site. You can visit it. You can see the organ, the conservatory, the dining room where he hosted inventors and senators. You can stand in the bedroom where he died. But the house doesn't feel lived in. It feels managed. Because it was always managed. Eastman didn't live there. He operated there. And when the operator logged off, the system kept running on autopilot. If you're wondering whether your own life is a system or a lived experience, that's the question the mansion forces. Now let's talk about what happened to the money. Eastman's will was 39 pages long. It had been revised multiple times. Every dollar had a destination. The executors were lawyers and bankers who understood fiduciary duty better than they understood Eastman as a person. The estate was worth somewhere between $75 and $100 million in 1932 money. Adjusted for inflation and market growth, that's multiple billions. None of it went to heirs, because there weren't any. All of it went to institutions. That's the third mechanism. Eastman structured his wealth to avoid human dependency. He gave money to universities, hospitals, and foundations because institutions don't ask questions, don't demand attention, and don't require emotional labor. They just execute. And for someone like Eastman, that was ideal. But it also meant that the wealth he accumulated never translated into relational security. It built buildings. It didn't build intimacy. Here's the part that's hard to hear. Eastman was profoundly generous. He gave away more than half his fortune while he was alive. He funded dental clinics for children who couldn't afford care. He endowed scholarships for students who had no other access to education. He built a music school that's still one of the best in the world. And he did all of it quietly, often anonymously. He didn't want recognition. He wanted impact. But impact, by definition, happens at a distance. And distance doesn't keep you alive when your body stops cooperating. This is where the psychology gets specific. Wealth of Eastman's scale doesn't just create options. It creates obligation. Every dollar has a potential use, which means every dollar not optimally deployed feels like failure. Eastman didn't just give money away because he was kind. He gave it away because letting it sit idle would violate the same efficiency principles that built his fortune. But that same logic applies to life. If your existence stops being productive, if your body becomes a cost center rather than an asset, then continuing feels like waste. And for someone who spent their entire life eliminating waste, that's unbearable. Wealth didn't fail him. Wealth succeeded exactly as designed. It removed material constraints. It built institutions. It ensured permanence. But it didn't solve the thing that no amount of capital can solve, which is the basic biological fact that bodies break down, and no system can manage pain into compliance. If you've ever wondered why so many wealthy people seem emotionally unreachable, this is part of why. Now let's go back to the house. Because the house is where the control fantasy becomes visible. Eastman installed a central panel in his bedroom that controlled lighting throughout the mansion. He had a telephone system that let him communicate with staff in any room. He had separate ventilation systems for different wings. He had custom-built furniture that maximized space and minimized inefficiency. Everything was designed to eliminate friction. But here's the paradox. The more control he engineered into the house, the more the house required him to operate it. And when his body stopped cooperating, the house didn't become a refuge. It became a monument to capacities he no longer had. The conservatory is the clearest example. Eastman built it to bring nature indoors. He hired gardeners to maintain rare plants. He installed climate control to replicate growing conditions from different parts of the world. It was beautiful. It was also completely artificial. Every leaf, every bloom, every bit of greenery existed because a system of labor and infrastructure kept it alive. The moment that system stopped, the conservatory would die. And Eastman knew that. Because that's how he lived. And at a certain point, he recognized he was the conservatory. This is the fourth mechanism. When wealth becomes identity, and identity becomes control, and control becomes unsustainable, there's no graceful exit. You either accept dependence, which feels like erasure, or you exit on your own terms, which feels like logic. Eastman chose logic. And because he had the resources to make that choice privately, efficiently, and without interference, he did. Most people don't get that option. They decline slowly, in hospitals, surrounded by systems designed to extend life regardless of quality. Eastman avoided that. But the cost of avoiding it was that he never had to confront whether life might still have value outside the framework of usefulness. He never tested whether intimacy, dependency, or diminished capacity might offer something his system couldn't quantify. He just ran the analysis and made the call. And that's where the story becomes unsettling. Because if wealth gives you the power to engineer your death with the same precision you engineered your success, then the question isn't whether you can. It's whether you should. And Eastman never asked that question. He just solved the problem. If you're starting to feel like this isn't just about Eastman, you're right. Now here's the legacy part, and it's more complicated than it seems. After Eastman died, Kodak continued to dominate the photography industry for another 70 years. The mansion was preserved. The charities he funded are still operating. His name is on concert halls and dental schools. By every conventional measure, his wealth succeeded in creating permanence. But here's what didn't survive. The memory of Eastman as a person. Most people know Kodak. Very few know Eastman. And the ones who do know him primarily for how he died, not how he lived. That's not failure. That's the inevitable outcome when you build systems instead of relationships. Systems outlast you. Relationships remember you. And Eastman built systems. The Eastman Museum in Rochester has thousands of photographs in its collection. Images of families, soldiers, landscapes, strangers. Every one of them captured using technology Eastman invented. But there are very few photographs of Eastman himself. And the ones that exist show a man in formal dress, unsmiling, positioned for efficiency rather than intimacy. He looks like someone who understood how to make images but didn't particularly want to be one. That's the fifth mechanism. When you spend your life creating infrastructure for other people's memories, you don't end up inside those memories. You end up adjacent to them. You're the condition that made the memory possible, not the subject of it. And if that was the goal, fine. But if the goal was to be remembered as a human being rather than a brand, the strategy failed. And that's not unique to Eastman. It's structural to how extreme wealth operates. The more you build, the less you inhabit. The more you control, the less you participate. The more efficiently you design your life, the less it feels like life. And at some point, you look around at the mansion, the foundation, the empire, and realize none of it required you personally. It just required capital. And capital is transferable. Eastman figured that out. And once he did, staying alive required a reason beyond the system's perpetuation. He didn't find one. Or maybe he decided there wasn't one. Either way, the system won. If you're thinking about who's running your system, that's the question that matters. Here's the final thing most people miss. Eastman's suicide wasn't a breakdown. It was a board meeting with one attendee. He assessed his assets. He assessed his liabilities. He ran the projections. And he concluded that continued operation was inefficient. The same logic that built Kodak ended George Eastman. And the precision of it is what makes it so disturbing. Because it means wealth doesn't insulate you from despair. It just gives you better tools to execute the conclusion. The wet towel was the detail that stayed with people. Not the gun. Not the note. The towel. Because it revealed that even in death, Eastman was thinking about systems. He didn't want to create unnecessary work for the staff who would find him. So he minimized the mess. That's not kindness. That's operational efficiency extended into the last possible moment. And if that's where the mind goes when it's deciding to stop existing, then something in the design was broken long before the trigger was pulled. The Kodak mansion still stands. You can tour it. You can see the organ, the conservatory, the bedroom. But you can't see the thing that mattered, which was the gap between what the house promised and what it delivered. It promised mastery. It delivered isolation. It promised permanence. It delivered a structure that outlasted its inhabitant by decades but couldn't make his life worth continuing. And that's the trade. You build something that survives you, and in exchange, you stop being the point. Eastman made that trade knowingly. He funded institutions that would operate long after his spine gave out, his vision faded, and his ability to control the house dissolved. Those institutions still exist. But George Eastman doesn't. And the version that survived in memory isn't the inventor, the philanthropist, or the organ player. It's the man who shot himself because the math stopped working. If that doesn't make you reconsider what wealth is actually for, nothing will. If that doesn't make you reconsider what wealth is actually for, nothing will. But here's the mechanism nobody talks about. Eastman didn't just build systems. He became one. And the moment a human being becomes a system, they stop operating on human metrics. Systems don't measure meaning. They measure throughput. They don't ask whether something feels right. They ask whether it functions. And when Eastman's body stopped functioning, the system did what systems do. It shut down the failing component. The lawyers who executed his will never questioned it. The staff who found him never questioned it. The institutions that received his money never questioned it. Because the logic was airtight. Eastman had decided. And decision-making authority, in his world, was absolute. That's what happens when you spend 50 years structuring every variable. People stop offering alternatives. They just wait for instructions. And that's the sixth mechanism. Wealth doesn't just buy silence. It buys agreement. When you're the person who funds the hospital, endows the school, and employs the staff, your decisions aren't debated. They're implemented. Even the decision to stop living. Especially that one. Because challenging it would require someone to claim they understood Eastman's situation better than he did. And nobody in his orbit had that kind of authority. He designed his life to make sure they didn't. So when he wrote, "My work is done," nobody asked whether the work included living. They just read the will, distributed the assets, and moved on. The system absorbed the loss and kept running. Which is exactly what Eastman built it to do. The mansion is still there. But the man who designed it proved that no amount of mahogany, no quantity of Tiffany glass, and no system of centralized control can make a life worth living when the body it's built around stops cooperating. He solved every problem except the one that mattered. And when that problem became unsolvable, he treated his life like he treated his factories. He shut it down. That's not tragedy. That's engineering. And if you're wondering whether the people around you see you as a person or a system, ask yourself what would happen if you stopped being useful. The answer will tell you everything.